This past summer, I was lucky enough to work at a canoe outfitters just outside of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. The Boundary Waters, or BWCA, is a government-regulated recreational wilderness area. In order to get into the Boundary Waters, you need a permit, and this is to regulate the traffic in the area and make sure not enough people come in. We only have the Boundary Waters today because of all that has been done in the past to protect it and keep it as pristine as it once was. In northern Minnesota, there are over 1,100 lakes spanning 1,500 miles, according to canoetrip.com, across the Canadian border. These chains of lakes form the Boundary Waters. They were formed around 10 to 12,000 years ago by glaciers that cut through the land and cut through the rock. When the glaciers melted and through aquifers and precipitation, pristine freshwater lakes were created. Prehistoric Native Americans came to the Boundary Waters around 11,000 years ago. They later developed into the Huron, Chippewa, and Cree tribes, and finally the most recent tribe in the Boundary Waters, the Ojibwe. Remnants of these tribes can be found through pictographs in remote areas of the Boundary Waters. And actually, Ojibwe is pretty prevalent in the Boundary Waters area still today, and many of the lakes are actually named after Ojibwe words, which is pretty cool. Next in the human history of the Boundary Waters came the fur traders. In the 17th century, European explorers came to the Boundary Waters and paved the way for European fur traders and trappers called voyageurs that traveled in canoes throughout the Boundary Waters area. As the U.S. continued to develop, colonization of the Boundary Waters area began, and with more colonization came more need for buildings, and this led to the beginning of the lumber industry in the Boundary Waters area. Most trees in the forests were logged off, and actually the majority of the forests in the Boundary Waters now were only planted in the 19th or 20th century due to the vast deforestation in the area. It wasn't until 1902 that Teddy Roosevelt decided to protect over 500,000 acres of the land and keep it from the lumber industry. And by 1908, he had created the Superior National Forest, which is over 1 million acres of protected forest land. Some of the boundaries of the Superior National Forest intersect with the Boundary Waters, but they're not the same thing. From the turn of the century until today, conservationists have worked to protect the Boundary Waters and keep it as pristine as it was in the past. So next I'll talk to you about how the BWCA became a protected area. Because of the rich resources in the area, many companies and people wanted to use those resources for profit. And industry such as mining and logging was prevalent in the area, as well as the proposal of dams and infrastructure in the area. But luckily, enough locals and conservation groups protested this to keep the Boundary Waters as they once were. A lot of this conservationism can be attributed to the sort of romantic ideal in the 19th and 20th century that a lot of Americans began to have when they saw that wilderness wasn't just resources, but actually as a recreational and beautiful land that they can use rather than use for profit. And so because of this idea of protecting the wilderness, the Civilian Conservation Corps created trails and portages in order to allow people to canoe and camp within the area and use it recreationally. Conservationists have been blocking the development in the Boundary Waters since the turn of the century. When dams were proposed in 1925 to create power generation in the area, conservation groups tried to block it for 5 years and eventually succeeded, which is great because it would have destroyed the Boundary Waters as we know it today. The privately owned land was inside the Boundary Waters was bought off and given to the government so they could protect it and stop infrastructure and resorts from being built. No-cut zones grew in number throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. In 1949, fly-ins were no longer allowed, and only planes over a certain elevation were allowed to cut down on the noise pollution in the area. Over time, most motors were limited, like motorboats and snowmobiles, but not in all places. In 1964, there was a breakthrough for the Boundary Waters when Congress passed the Wilderness Act. This protected wilderness areas all over the United States, including the Boundary Waters. However, it wasn't quite enough because industries such as logging, copper nickel ores, and motorized vehicles were still allowed in the Boundary Waters. It wasn't until 1978 that all this ended when the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Bill was passed. This restricted all motors within the borders of the Boundary Waters, and it ended mining and logging there for good. Many people and organizations worked to help to move forward the conservation efforts of the Boundary Waters. For example, the IWLA, or Isaac Walton League of America, was a conservation group that, according to canoecountry.com, has been working since 1925 in the Boundary Waters to help protect it when they were the leading group in blocking that dam bill that could have been built or could have been passed. Sigurd Olson is a celebrated and well-known Boundary Waters activist who he even was asked to help draft the 1964 Wilderness Act. He's written journals and books and essays about the Boundary Waters and lived there his whole life, so he's a very kind of prominent figurehead for the Boundary Waters movement. Another organization to note is the Friends of the Boundary Waters, and they were created in 1976 as a nonprofit organization just to help the Boundary Waters in general for all issues, and they were vital for the 1978 Act to be passed. As you can see, the Boundary Waters are more than just a pristine wilderness. The history, both natural and human, is long and rich, and after industry threatened it, people, locals, and conservation groups fought tirelessly to protect the area and keep it as it once was. Today, the Boundary Waters is a place for people to go and relax in the wilderness and enjoy it, and so I hope one day you're lucky enough to enjoy it as well.